Though I can also say that my jacket was made of cloth woven in Yorkshire, I don't know how it will hold up against a chainsaw. I might come back to the future if my jacket becomes beyond repair. If you're unfamiliar with me, I'm a training bespoke tailor at the moment, and a weeb apparently, and I make guides to get people started in bespoke tailoring, and sewing to a lesser extent. If you're interested in seeing me make a Sebastian Michaelis cosplay, then I think, with largely canon methods, then I think you will find this interesting. If you follow me for guides and methods in making bespoke tailoring, I will be going very thoroughly over a lot of the details for drafting and constructing things like a tailcoat, if a non-traditional one at that, as well as lesser things like dinner trousers, though there are accompanying smaller guides for things like the button fly and the braceback trousers that merit their own thorough deep dive or thorough guides. With a tailcoat, it should generally be made with a black or midnight barathea, which is usually a matte and quite weighty cloth. Morning coats are made with a black featherweave material, which is more of a mid-weight worsted cloth. Morning coats can also be made with a grey, I think they call it a morning grey, which again is a mid-weight worsted, and it can be worn as a suit. But you often find the black jacket with what can be referred to as cashmere stripe trousers, though they aren't necessarily made of cashmere, that's just what it's called. The waistcoat is often double-breasted and made of silk, in a contrasting material. Tailcoats are almost always worn as a suit, so the trousers are of the same material, and they have 2 rows of a narrow braid down the outleg. In this case, Sebastian has a silk ribbon down the outleg, so that's what I'm making these with. I give specific measures in metric and imperial. Occasionally they're not exact conversions, rather something that's just easy to say. So if I say 1 centimeter or half an inch, then I'm using 1.2 centimeters, which is about half an inch. On the other hand, if I say 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch, then that is 1 centimeter. Often in that context, though, that's the seam allowance. Anyway, first step is drafting a tailcoat pattern. I won't be drawing out the pattern from scratch. I am starting with my latest and greatest jacket pattern that fits already, and I'm converting it to a tailcoat model. It's much easier to start with a pattern than it is to draft from the start, especially when it already fits. As bespoke patterns are typically cut, I'm drawing the side line onto the paper at right angles to the edge so that each piece is level. This is just discipline of pattern cutting. The back piece of my jacket goes onto the side line, and I trace around it, taking the other lines like the waist and the across back. The first alterations to make is at the waist. 5 centimeters or 2 inches below the waistline, I am marking a new line, which is the top of the tail, basically. From the center back line, measure 6 centimeters or 2.5 inches and mark that on vertically, only a small amount down and up to about the cross-back line. This will make the seams on the back. I've heard these referred to as patrol seams. I do not know the exact way of drawing the curve here, or if there is a specific way, but I think that it should be almost a quarter segment of a circle between the 2 points. In my experience, it's best to have a good pattern like this already, and then copy the curve from that. It also needs a notch so that the apex of the curve can be matched with certainty. The notch is typically placed where the curve intersects the horizontal that denotes the top of the side seam. Right onto either side of the line that the seam allowance needs to be added when the cloth is cut. Mark on the seams 6 centimeters or 5 3/8 below the waist. This is to match the tail plus a seam allowance, because the tail on the back gets grown on from the first mark on the back. Lastly, writing how much cloth needs to be added below the back for the length of the tails. The coat should be down to the back of the knee. Take the nape to the knee measure and take off the length of the new back pattern and write that onto the stub of the back. The hem of the back side body, where it connects to what you could call the skirt, needs to curve slightly upwards as it joins to the side seam below the waistline. At the side seam, you could mark 3.5 to 5 centimeters or 1.5 to 2 inches below the waist and curve that down to the back side body seam. My jacket pattern has a side body, but sometimes a tailcoat forepart is one piece with a dart. Since my jacket pattern fits really well, then I want to change it as little as possible. The seam allowance for the underarm seam is also included, so I can copy it as it is. At the side seam, the new bottom edge needs to be the same length as the back. It should curve up to meet the underarm seam. I try to place the front piece so that the bottom of the forepart is touching, so that it's easiest to draw a continuous seam from the front edge, copying it off. Nothing really needs to be changed except the shape. For a tailcoat that shouldn't overlap on the front, I shorten the front edge by 1.5 to 2 centimeters, or 5/8 to 3/4 of an inch. The break line would be changed to match the new front edge. The front edge should also end 6 or 7 centimeters, or 2.25 to 2.5 inches below the waistline, and should chip into the pattern 2 centimeters, or 3/4. From that point, it needs to curve upwards to meet the underarm seam. The hem can be changed at any point here to improve the overall run. To find where the front of the tail should go, measure 15 centimeters or 6 inches from the low point of the jacket along the bottom edge. With this point, it can either be made a balance point, or the front dart can be shifted slightly to be used as the front point of the tails or skirt and sewn to the tail, which is the method I use. I'm not shifting it, I'm rotating it so that the inside edge of the dart meets the edge of the skirt or tail. I'm shifting it, pivoting from a little above the top of the dart, though it should be pivoted from the chest line, which is where we generally want the suppression to be. From what I've read about tailcoats, this is basically how a normal one would be made. I need to make changes from the normal evening tailcoat in order to make it more like the classic Sebastian tailcoat. I lowered the bottom edge another 10 centimeters or 4 inches and raised the break point the same amount, something I would do when making a 3-button jacket. It gives me a starting point and practically working with the same point at the tail. I found a few sources to use as a starting point for the design, as well as my own ideas regarding what it's supposed to look like. I mostly drew from what I was told to, where he's wearing the single-breasted tailcoat instead of the double-breasted that he wears for a lot of Season 1 of the anime. To draft out the tail or the skirt, the hem from the back side body needs to be measured to find out how wide the tail needs to be at the top. Measured without the seam allowances, so I drew them on at the seams to measure between. That's the width of the tail, and the length of the tails is what's written on the back at the waist to make the back the full length to the back of the knee. Make a right angle below the current draft. Make a parallel mark 6 cm or 2 3/8 of an inch from the height line and a seam allowance below the width line. Measure 20 centimeters or 8 inches down from the width. Mark horizontally on that and measure 1 centimeter and 1 centimeter, or half an inch and half an inch. From the seam allowance mark, make a straight line through the first horizontal points. Measure the height of the tails plus 1 centimeter seam allowance along the line to find the bottom of the tails, making a horizontal line from the base. Measure 20 centimeters or 8 inches, join that up to the front point of the tails in a straight line to make a guideline. At the previous point, make a 45-degree line that can be used as a guide for drawing the curve about 10 or 15 or 4 to 6 inches from the base. From the earlier point along the first horizontal for the tail, measure the width of the tails that was measured from the body of the jacket. Measure it, adding 1 seam allowance, and add 1.5 centimeters or 5/8 of an inch for a small dart. The dart should be placed so that it's in line with the side seam. Mark vertically a few inches straight down. Measure the finished width of the little back piece plus the seam allowance, because the seam allowance is down the back of the tail where it joins to the center main back piece. Make a straight line from the front of the tail to the bottom as a rough guide to the shape. The tail should curve from the front point at the hem of the coat, staying straight for about 8 centimeters or 3 inches on the construction line. At the back of the tails, to create the seam from the 1 centimeter point below the start point through the second 1 centimeter point or the half-inch point at the line 20 centimeters or 8 inches below the back, all the way to the bottom to shape the tails. From the front point, draw a line from the front, keeping straight for the first 3 inches, through the point on the 45-degree line from earlier to the base of the tail again to shape the front of the tails. As you can see, I decided that I do not much like the original lines I made, so I ignored that point. In this case, I wanted a much more pointed tail. In normal cases, the base of the tail should be nearly horizontal for an inch or so to make it much more easy to make it later on. At the break line again, I'm drawing on the initial lapel shape, just to get myself an indication of what it is that I want to do. Giving it a little gap between the collar and the peak of the lapel, as Sebastian often wears his tailcoat. Cutting everything out, I'm leaving this section in to help illustrate which lines I'm following here. Snipping into the balance points and the specific dart that's drawn on which I intend to use that the tails are drawn to. Interestingly, for those interested at least, a tailcoat is one of a few types of bodycoat. The bodycoat is the basis for the frock coats and the morning coat, which are the precursors to the current style of jacket that we see and generally make today. With a tailcoat, it should generally be made with a black or midnight barathea, which is usually a matte and quite weighty cloth. Morning coats are made with a black featherweave material, which is more of a mid-weight worsted cloth. Morning coats can also be made with a grey, I think they call it a morning grey, which again is a mid-weight worsted, and it can be worn as a suit. But you often find the black jacket with what can be referred to as cashmere stripe trousers, though they aren't necessarily made of cashmere, that's just what it's called. The waistcoat is often double-breasted and made of silk in a contrasting material. Tailcoats are almost always worn as a suit, so the trousers are made of the same material, and they usually have two parallel rows of a narrow braid down the outleg. In this case, though, Sebastian has a silk ribbon going down his outleg, like you more commonly find in just tuxedo trousers. But that's what I'm going with. Making a last check of the skirt's width before drawing its top seam. Ensuring the dart is lined up to the side seam. The front of the tail had to be pushed forwards by a small amount. In fairness, it could have been left and then fixed with the inlay when it was basted. Drafting the final seam along the top, the tailcoat needs to be a convex line that bends outside of the pattern, which forces the tails to clip close to the legs. I have done much the opposite and made a concave line into the pattern. That does much the opposite. Shortly before drafting this, I'd been party to a frock overcoat pattern where the skirt is supposed to flare and be pulled upwards and open. It'll be noticed that I fix it later slightly and then the rest of the way after trying it on. It'll be noticed later that a straight edge is also not sufficient for a tailcoat. After cutting the seam across the top, I just need to make sure the dart remains the correct width, and then afterwards cutting it out so that I can lay the body patterns together in order to do just one final check that the tail or the skirt is the correct length. So I overlap the seam allowances across the body, and at the side body the seam allowances are included on the paper, so I have to overlap those. I am shaving tiny bits off of the edge of the tails, off of the front edge of the tails pattern, just because, well, no particular reason, just to smooth out the runs a bit better so that it makes better. When I put the tail up to it, I have to close the dart, and there is one seam allowance across the back of the tail, so I put that over the back side body because that doesn't have a seam allowance, and then the front edge should be lined up to the front of the dart, or the back of the dart. Finally, I label the patterns. Because I'm a weeb, I label them with Sebastian and just the date that I make them. I use the original sleeves from the jacket this was cut from because the armholes haven't been changed at all yet. But goodness, watching me label each individual pattern is painful. Well, not so much painful, just boring. Placing the front and side body level at the waist towards the raw edge of the cloth with at least 2.5 centimeters or 1 inch from the selvage for inlay. The line I place the waistline onto that was already chalked is along the weft of the cloth, which puts the rest of the pattern correctly on the grain. I'm leaving those there for a moment that ought to be weighed down, but I'm lacking weights at this moment. To position the back length of the tail, it needs to be measured from the raw edge by the fold plus 7 centimeters or 3 inches of inlay. To place the back on the grain properly, it is noted that the waist on the centre back seam is suppressed 2 centimeters, 3/4 of an inch from the neck. Therefore, the distance from the fold at the waist needs to be 2 centimeters more than that of the distance at the neck. At the waist, going all the way down the back, there should be 6 centimeters or 2.5 inches of or so to sufficiently make a proper brick tack. In this case, I give it 5 centimeters or 2 inches at the waist, so I measured 3 centimeters or 1.25 inch at the neck. This was just enough to make the vent properly. The width of the tail needs to be marked all the way down so that when it's made, it can be made straight and proper. The suppression at the bottom edge of the pattern from the fold can just be measured all the way down. Then the width of the pattern needs to be carried on, and lastly, the inside edge needs to be given the same amount of inlay as well. The inside edge actually only needs about 1 inch, but if you want to be really safe, then just do the same amount. Before finding a place for the back side body, I need to put the inlay onto the forepart in order to make sure there is enough space for it, and otherwise using the cloth the most economically. Adding the internal details of the jacket pattern, like the outbreast pocket and the dart, marking the drop right shoulder line, putting 1.25 inches of inlay on the shoulder, 1 inch over the lapel, about 2 inches below the hem, which I increased to about 3 or so later, and about 1.5 inches on the side seam as well as over the top of the armhole. The back side body will generally be raised above the armhole because it does not fit into the gap with the inlay added, placing it 7 centimeters or 3 inches above the front side body inlay so that there is enough inlay at the hem, which was important since as it transpired I used almost all of it. Placing the waistline against the weft of the cloth by finding the right angle to the fold of the cloth, which is the same as right angles to the back inlay. Keeping the patrol seam 1 centimeter or 3/8 from the inlay so that the seam allowance can be added. Carefully adding the seam allowance, adding the inlays past the hem, keeping the seams flaring out so that they won't become tight when they're folded up for the fitting and the finish. From the seam allowance, the back shoulder inlay should be added, and it should spring upwards away from the pattern rather than just continue straight. The inlay from the side seam should extend to about 1 centimeter or 1/2 inch from the patrol seam. At this moment, only because I haven't done it yet rather than some intentional order of working, I trace the back pattern. Adding the inlay on the neck and the shoulder seams. At the top of the patrol seams, the inlay needs to be about the same as the top of the seam on the back side body and 2.5 centimeters or 1 inch at the top, giving the patrol seam itself the seam allowance. Worth to note that when making a tailcoat, the hind arm seam of the sleeve should match the patrol seam, but when there is a drop shoulder, either the sleeve needs to be changed to match the seam, or the seam on the back and the side body needs to be lowered on one side by the same amount as the armhole is dropped in order to match the seams later. The inlay down the back needs to be extended upwards only by as much as the seam above where the brick tack is to be placed, so that it can be properly made. The tack should potentially be where the pattern was cut off below the waist, but I have left it to about 1 inch above the waistline, so that there's plenty, since this is my first body coat and brick tack. The facing of a tailcoat is generally silk, and therefore it wouldn't need space to cut out a facing from. What Jana has drawn, though, appears to have a self-facing like a morning coat. I'm putting it just above the forepart, and as a tailcoat, not a morning coat, the facing only needs to cover the forepart, and none of the tail. Therefore, just marking about the height of the forepart plus inlay to reserve. This results in a lay that is much closer to that of a morning coat. The undersleeve gets placed with the hem inlay against the shoulder, finding the distance from the top and bottom of the forearm seams from the fold of the cloth to leave plenty of cloth against the fold to use as the top collar. The tails here are placed above the undersleeve against the fold of the cloth. The top sleeve is placed with the forearm seam towards the selvage next to the tails. The tail is placed so the inlay along the bottom is above the top of the top sleeve inlay. Again, this leaves cloth for the top collar. There is inlay on the front and back seams to match the amount of inlay on the side seam. The front edge and the hem of the back, it needs to be placed on the grain as it was cut. So there was a suppression of about 6 centimeters or 2¼ inches at the top and nothing at the bottom, as it were. So I gave the side seams 4 centimeters or 1½ inches of inlay, so I give the same to the back edge of the tails. Again, normally the top sleeve would be as high up the cloth next to the skirt of the morning coat, and the space between it and the forepart would be left for the facing and other trims. In this case it's a tailcoat, so the skirt is much more narrow, making it much easier to put the top sleeve next to it. In this case, the canvas again is cut rather normally, unlike a morning coat. Here, the canvas is largely cut to match the forepart in much the same as a normal jacket. A morning coat would have canvas left extending below the hem of the jacket to be sewn to the skirt. Here, for the purposes of this jacket, having to wear it in hot weather, I'm lightly canvassing rather than a typical West End with chest canvas and demette. There will just be an extra layer of body canvas over the chest. Padding and darting the canvases as rather normal otherwise. The lining can be cut at this stage, but it can also be done after the fitting, which is what I decide to do here. As indicated earlier, I realised that I accidentally cut the tails with a concave seam, so I reran the edge, effectively picking up the front of the tails. It was difficult to see from my perspective at the time, but I can see now that all I had done was straighten out the seam rather than turn it into the convex seam that I wanted. Theoretically, the bottom of the back and the tails should be lowered, but I may leave that to the fitting. But with that halfway fixed, now the darts are put into the tails ahead of making the baste. Lastly, regarding the tails at this moment, tailcoats like this generally have a layer of body canvas inside the tails to maintain the shape, structure, and such like. In morning coats, a layer of silicea is put into the back seam and the front edge is, well, taped. Given the specific requirements of my hirsute, I'm making this tailcoat structured much more like a morning coat, without the canvas. Somewhat glossing over the previous steps of sewing the darts into the foreparts, sewing the front side body to the forepart, and basting the side seam to connect the back side body as well. Notably, I have not applied canvas to the forepart yet. Basting the tail onto the forepart, placing the top raw edge against the mark stitches of the hem, lining the dart up to the side seam. The mark stitches on the back seam of the tails should then line up to the raw edge of the back side body, basting with the normal seam allowance. The stitch needs to be tacked at the front of the tails, leaving the inlay to be folded underneath for an accurate idea of the finished shape. During the second tail, I had the idea to fold the inlay before tacking it at the front, folding the tail over and top stitching the seam at the hem of the jacket before proceeding straight to basting the tails along their edges, stopping short of the bottom so that it can be sewn down to the tail or to the length of the back. I didn't want to go too far into making the canvases, nor will I go too deep into the canvassing of the foreparts, since that should be sufficiently covered elsewhere. In my typical method of going straight from the neck point straight down, then to either side. The hems past the tails can be pressed up, and then the hem of the front edge and the lapel can be folded over the mark stitches. Before the edge of the hem can be basted, the bridles need to be added in to draw in the chest, pressing in the ease over the chest, taking this moment to underpress a little bit and to press the top of the break line while the jacket is still easily maneuverable. A note to cut down any canvas that's peeking past the cloth. And with the foreparts basted, the patrol pleats need to be basted too. The centre back seam is basted down to where the pattern was cut off and then top stitched, and the inlay folded over to one side and the vent tacked at the same point to simulate the future vent. Obviously, since it was on the fold, it needs to be cut to actually show it to open. Starting at the notch that was placed onto the apex of the curves, place the back onto the side body, or vice versa, raw edges together, and begin to baste along the seam. It needs to be a slightly smaller and firmer stitch than normal, since it's on a curved seam. The seams need to be sewn without easing anything either way, or stretching anything either way. As the seam was drawn and then given seam allowance, it should be exactly net. To the hem of the side body, it needs to be basted still along the seam, but as it approaches the hem, the inlay on the back may be obscuring exactly where that is. It should be basically a straight line, but it should also end a seam from the mark stitches, indicating the inlay on the back tails, or going down the back. The mark stitches on the back inlay also goes into the tails seam from its mark stitches. What I usually do is tack the baste at the hem, because it saves sewing a length down the tails, and in doing so, not having to line up the edges properly. At the notch again, placing the raw edges together and basting towards the armhole. It doesn't actually matter which way around this is done, this is just how I did this side, I suppose. The seam then has to be top stitched, which will sew the tails to the back down to the hem. The back needs to be flat, with the side body seams and tails folded over on top of the back all the way down to the hem. This side started from the armhole and then working down. The top stitch on the back side body by the seam to hold down the seam allowances underneath. As I get further down, just positioning the back and tail a little more neatly with the tail on top of the back. Making a small tack just above the tail, it needs to be folded so that the mark stitches are one seam allowance inside of the fold. The fold is then placed up to the mark stitches of the back. Hopefully this helps to understand why I did not baste down the tail from the outside inside beforehand. Positioning the tails onto the back is much more easy from the outside, though it needs to be done from the inside on the finish, but I do things to make it easier at that point. The linen and silesia could have both been added in the baste or left until the finish. The same if you will use canvas in the tail. It could be used in the baste or left out and only added when making the finish. The seam on the tails are curved, specifically near the top, so it has to be pulled and maneuvered over the mark stitches going down the back. Placing the other patrol seams together at the notches and beginning to baste them together. Conveniently, since this is cloth I'm working on, it can be bent and curved to match the edges together to baste them. There can be a concern that due to the seams being completely inverted, it's possible to accidentally ease the side body seam into the back seam by a small amount. Therefore, it is important to take note at the armhole mark stitches and the waistline mark stitches that both of those are lined up. If not, ease would have to be released from the seam, most likely from the back side body. As the seams are being basted, it doesn't necessarily matter which side is on top or the bottom, or which direction is sewn first. Though I expect the people who make good morning coats do have a specific way around that they do things. I'm just not one of those people. On the left-hand side, I start top stitching the tails down onto the back. Again, the tail is folded over by a seam allowance, so the mark stitches are 1 cm or 3/8 inside of the fold, and the fold is placed onto the mark stitches going down the back. Top stitching the seam towards the shoulder, no real reason why I did it in that order, other than it must have been most comfortable for me there. Then I'm basting the back hem up and basting in the shape of the tails. Starting with folding the hem up, which should be level with the bottom shape of the tails, or skirt. With my more pointed design, it folds exactly where the tails transition onto the back. Generally, it would continue horizontally in line with the back hem for a small amount before beginning to curve. The last bit here is pulling out some of the shoulder mark stitches that indicate the drop right on the appropriate sides. I won't go too far or at all into basting the shoulders, collars and sleeves because this is going on long enough and there is little to talk about that is not normal in Bespoke wise at least. There are two separate guides on specific sections of this trouser for the bracebacks and button flies, so I will just gloss very quickly over raising the waistband. Placing the pattern onto the cloth and lining it up. Strike it out except for the waistband. Chalking on the top side dart, continue the fly seam straight above the current waist and measure above the waistline 4 or 5 centimeters or 1.5 to 2 inches. The waist seam I want to keep about the same, so I bring up the waistline to the front of the raised waistline and find the side seam. With the center line of the dart going straight up, I can mark where the original top of the dart was and then narrow the dart towards the new waistline. It depends on the figure, but the general rule is that the trousers need to get larger above the original waist before it got narrowed from the seat to the trouser waist. With inlay and balance points, the underside should be drafted next. Practically the same thing, striking out most of it and measuring the same amount above the waistline, carrying on the darts, narrowing them from the original waistline. The seat seam needs to be continued straight and the pattern needs to be used to find where the side seams should go on the new waistline. I go into the details of bracebacks in another guide, same for the waistcoat. Although I did find this Sebastian body pillow that I did not buy and do not sleep with every night, that shows that he wears a belt. Similarly, on the bridge of the Campania, he shows him not wearing braces, but it was the style of the time, so I'm adding braces. Another change I made was the waistcoat back. The one that's drawn has, well, technically no back, only a strap around the waist and the neck, as is clear when he's making curry or after Grell ruins his coat. I don't know how to do that, so like most cosplayers, I just make something that superficially looks correct. With the waistcoat, I basically just draft a normal waistcoat pattern that, well, approximately fits me or fits me quite well, and then, well, I base that up and use it in the fitting, or change it in the fitting. Since there is, theoretically, guides for everything but the tailcoat, I'm skipping everything else up to the fitting. The waistcoat is a basic waistcoat that I planned to sort out in and after the fitting. The obvious issue with the waistcoat is that the bottom edge is too low. The normal bottom buttoning point of the waistcoat should be on the waistline seam. Second issue with the waistcoat is that the front balance appears far too long, which is why it's falling away and not closed. I get a pin to pick up the shoulder. This doesn't have anything to do with the back, which is why it should be left alone in this alteration. Only the front and at the shoulder should be picked up. I pinned out about 1/2 inch or 1 centimeter on the double. Here's me finding the waistband seam on the waistcoat to check where it should be buttoned, which is why it was important to try on the trousers and the waistcoat together. Again, looking back, I think the back balance is very long on the waistcoat, which is why it's a bit baggy and sagging, but I didn't notice that at the time, so I don't think I ever fixed it. I don't have any braces at this moment. I made the mistake of referring to them as suspenders with a lawyer one time, but in British English, braces keep your trousers up, and suspenders keep your stockings up. Notably with the trousers though, on the front fly it is sagging a bit, so I end up picking it up at the centre front about half a centimetre, or a quarter of an inch. Picking the waistcoat up, obviously there's no gap anymore, but it could perhaps be picked up a little more and maybe straightened a small amount as well. For the jacket, despite the bottom edge being very high, the other large issue is the tail splitting open at the vent. With tailcoats, there are a few factors that can affect the overlap at the vent, largely the back balance being too long or too short. I illustrate by hunching forward, which closes the vent that potentially is the back is too long for my posture, causing the fabric at the back to almost collapse, similar to what I said about the back on the waistcoat. The shape of the tails can also be a factor, which will be noted I did quite badly. The bottom edge of the back pattern could also be raised, which would raise the back of the tail seams and potentially push the vent closed. As it is, I am pinning out the cloth across the back, which shortens the back balance. As it can easily be seen, the vent is sitting much more close than it was before. The effect of shortening the back, which will be shown how to do later, is the armhole gets smaller. Looking back, I can see that the sigh, or armhole if you like, might be quite high here and causing the diagonal pulls towards the underarm. So I should have lowered the armhole or dropped the front balance instead. What I decided to do was shorten the crown of the sleeve, which usually is a feature that makes the sleeve more mobile. I need to mark the bottom edges of the jacket onto the waistcoat so that they can be properly adjusted together. Generally, the bottom edge of the waistcoat should sit just inside of the jacket. Sebastian's waistcoat usually bleeds out from underneath, which is generally incorrect, so I do a sort of a half-half kind of thing you'll see in the second fitting. Lastly, for this first fitting, I want to check the lapel patterns. I wanted something with a very low gorge and a peak pointing towards the armhole a bit more than is typical. The lapel on the right shoulder is lower and much closer to what I'm looking for here. The tails are flaring somewhat, bellowing as they go around my legs because the seam is far too straight and not convex at all. But it's good at least that I realized my mistake beforehand. I don't know how it would have looked if I'd left it how it was. The follow-up fitting, I did not change anything except the bottom edges, since it was I had a time crunch and I needed to refit it within an hour or so. I added lapel shapes just as an indication for myself. I raised the bottom edge of the waistcoat to meet the trousers and lowered the edge of the jacket to meet the waistcoat. The tails could also possibly be flared slightly more on the back seam from the top to the bottom edge, make that width wider. I'd hesitate to shorten the back much more than I have done, though I pin out about an inch from the top of the tails so that the seam along the top is much more curved, which I thought I had done but couldn't see very well when I did it. That finally fixes the front view though. That concludes making the pattern and fitting the tailcoat, and to a lesser extent the suit. In the following video, I make the alterations to the pattern and then sew the jacket together to finish making it. In the final video is some of the hand finishing and finishing touches to the suit.